G'day you mob, and welcome to the Aussie English Podcast, the number one place for anyone and everyone wanting to wrap their head around the dialect of English that is Aussie English, and get a fair dose of our culture, history, news and current affairs. Today's special guest is Kate Burridge, who is a Professor of Linguistics at Monash University and Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. So I spied Kate on the ABC News channel recently talking about the new slang that has popped up in Australia because of coronavirus. Things like ISO, meaning isolated, Sani from sanitizer, and the Rona from coronavirus. So I thought it'd be a great excuse to get her onto the podcast to chat a little bit about that, but also talk about Australian English, why it's so unique, its slang, and also more broadly the history of English, why it's such an interesting language. So we kind of go in many different directions in this interview, guys, but I hope you find it interesting. If you're learning English or if you're just interested in English, I think you're going to get a lot out of it. Anyway, Professor Kate Burridge, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. Kick the bird, and let's go, guys. Kate Burridge, Professor of Linguistics at Monash University. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to get you on today. I saw you, as we were just talking about, on ABC News. They pulled you up, and I'd seen that story going around, not with you per se, but the whole Aussie coronavirus slang thing. And at first I was a bit dubious. As someone who teaches Australian English, I was like, has someone just kind of like tried to make these Aussie slang words and make an article and get a bit of publicity? But it seems like whether or not they were sort of fabricated at first, they've caught on to some degree, because I definitely have heard people running around saying ISO and Sani now.
Oh, yes.
But can you talk a bit about that and what's happened during coronavirus here in Australia with our language?
But I also think that it's sweeping the world. I think people just love creating words. There's a word for that, which is leximania, because we just love creating words, and that's what drives language, and particularly vocabulary, because it just changes more than any other aspect of language. But yes, certainly in Australia, slang has always been a really crucial part of Australian English, right from the beginning. I mean, there are early accounts of Australian English where visitors are struck by, well, the number of slang words, the sort of underworld slang that's becoming sort of mainstream, flash language or kiddie language it's called.
I got into this a while back, and I was getting my Kel Richards dose of, I mean, for those who can't see, it's the story of Australian English. So it's kind of a short book giving you a dense history in how Australian English kind of evolved and changed after colonisation from Britain, right? It's a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, it is. It's a sort of melting pot of dialects, but, and you can, what went into the dialect were the slang and dialect vocabularies of London particularly, but the cant of the underworld, cant of the underworld slang. In fact, slang originally was underworld jargon. And it became just a sort of earmark of Australian English, an important part of Australianness. And it's been like that ever since. So we kind of wear, emblems, items of slang like emblems on a T-shirt. They really are an important part of who we are.
It is crazy.
I was going to say the coronavirus ones are just taking off. And, of course, they fit in nicely with the ISO being the O ending that we put on.
Mm-hmm.
Shortened forms, and the E of Sani fits in nicely because we love to shorten words to one syllable and put on these what are sometimes called hyperchoristics, or these cuddly kind of endings. The difference between I and O is what's a puzzle for linguists.
Well, there's A as well, right? Because you'll hear things like sanger, and they're a little more rare, but you'll hear them from time to time. Why have Australians gravitated towards that shortening of words and making slang words, but also those three sort of endings for slang?
Yeah, it is a little bit of a puzzle because they are quite old, and of course they appear in mainstream Englishes as well around the world. I mean, you get them on particularly the I and the O. You get them on personal names, Susie, Katie, Robbo. But they're just so much a part of Australian English, and they're sometimes wrongly described as diminutives, but
yes,
that sounds like something coming out of the nursery.
Well, when I read that in Kel Richards' book, I think he was referring to them as diminutives, and I was like, it sounds a little negative,
Exactly, and you get grown up Australian males talking about politicians as pollies, of course. And it's not because we think of politicians as endearing little creatures, and it's very different from doggy or something like that would come out of the nursery. So, yeah, they are interesting. It seems we like short words. We don't like any pretentious long words. It's part of the informality. One linguist at the ANU describes these sorts of shortenings and just our love of colloquialisms generally as being kind of linguistic enactments of these kind of cherished ideals, which you could talk at length about whether they exist or not, but certainly our love of informality.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you there, how tied is Australian slang to Australian culture?
Oh, much slang is. I mean, language is anyway, isn't it? It's part of our identity, particularly words, much more than other aspects of the language. And that's what takes words too down incredible paths, takes them on extraordinary journeys in shifts of meaning or in different way. They change their shape over time. And yeah.
Man, we're getting onto all the stuff that I was going to ask you about. But what was staying with Aussie slang, what is it, do you think, about our culture then? Because I assume that's kind of the bedrock on which slang and language evolves after the fact. Mm-hmm. Because I was reading in Kel Richards' book that Australia has something like, I think he'd been keeping a list, 5,000 different diminutives that he was calling them. And when he tried to compare that to other countries, I think, for example, Canada had 1,000, if that. And so it was very interesting to see that Australia had done 5 times fold worth of slang creation. What do you think it is about our cultures that underpins that, if there's something?
And it is interesting because normally slang has a very short shelf life. Handful of slang terms will survive. And that's the nature of slang, because if it's going to be slangy, if it's going to be catchy, if it's going to startle, if it's going to shock, it's got to be new. And if slang survives, then it becomes mainstream and part of the standard language. But a small percentage will survive. But there's no sign we are losing these diminutives, if you call them that loosely, these shortenings with the endings. In fact, they seem to be on the increase. You've got new ones like the deso for the designated driver. And that's an interesting, because that shows you, in fact, that the O endings do seem to be, and one linguist, in fact, the linguist I mentioned from the ANU did point out that so many ones with O endings are the longer, more complicated, less usual words. So methylated spirits to metho, or designated driver to deso. And the others with the E endings, like sani for sanitizer, or hand sanitizer, they do seem to be more everyday. But it still doesn't really explain what is the difference between the I and the O, because why is I don't know, someone who works on the wharf for wharfie, but a musician is a muso? There is a PhD thesis in here, Pete.
I know. It is so funny, though, because when I started creating content on Aussie English, I had no background in teaching English. I had never studied it. My background's in science. I have a PhD in evolutionary biology that has nothing to do with this. But I found it interesting because a lot of these words I had no idea was slang. I was just like, but they're just the words we use, like servo. And, it was funny that I had no idea just how much they were unique in terms of the broader English, and even just Australia having access to so much external culture from America and Britain. You kind of understand their slang, although subconsciously you never use it, or like consciously you would never go out of your way to use it, right? It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, you're quite right. It's and I think that's also because of big social changes happening in the world, don't you? That we are very much more laid back now, that we can actually have a conversation about slang, and it's worthy of putting into a podcast on the English language. Once upon a time, it was, just not, it was not written down.
Yeah.
But we're all much more laid back, and it's kind of hard to find examples of formal language now, really, because you think how even writing by journalists has changed much more every day. So the grammar's changed, everything.
So how has Australian English changed since it split from British English? And what was the process that was going on, especially in the early years there?
Well, usually linguists do talk about a melting pot effect. So when you get a bunch of dialects coming together in that way, as would have happened in those early times, so principally, from the south, east of England, from Ireland, from Scotland, sort of in diminishing amounts in that melting pot. goes through a kind of a levelling process. So what emerges from the melting pot is a fairly uniform sort of dialect. Because what's interesting is what features triumph in the melting pot too. And parallels have always been drawn between Australian English and London English, certainly in terms of the different, what are sometimes called sociolects, the sort of so-called cultivated Australian at the posh end of it, and the broad Australian English at the other end, and the general Australian English in the middle. And that's another difference too, because we all tend to now be gravitating towards the middle.
Yeah.
Moving away from the posh end. None of us want to speak la-di-da anymore, whereas that was once the desired accent, to sound as British as possible. BBC English, that was what you heard on the radio.
Well, that's anytime we watch, I've seen a few of those short videos from the 60s and 50s on ABC's YouTube channel, and they have the strangest accents, to me at least. That you can tell they're kind of Australian, but they sound much closer to this sort of standard British flat received pronunciation, right?
That's right. And we just don't hear that sort of thing anymore. But so, why did those features triumph, I suppose, to go back to the melting pot? And it's one of the puzzles. Why, for example, did more features of Irish English enter into Australian English? Very, very few features, really. Use, the plural you, could well be from Irish English, but then again, English is aberrant in not having a plural you. It's much more usual, and in fact, I think it is pretty sure it is the only Indo-European language that doesn't have singular you and a plural you.
Yeah, it's definitely. I speak French and Portuguese, and they both use them, and in different ways. It's interesting, and the weird thing I've found with Portuguese. And this will blow your mind if you don't know anything about Portuguese. But I learnt French for 10 years, and it's the grammar is how you speak. But when I learned Portuguese, it's like, yeah, that's the grammar, but only, toffs and wankers speak like that. And they break all the rules. So you'll conjugate, you with the third person. You'll conjugate vocês, which is the plural you, with they. And so it's all mucked up compared to Portuguese, the Brazilian Portuguese. But it is crazy how obviously it just, no one makes those rules, right? It kind of just happens and then settles.
That's right. Well, what's written in handbooks and grammar books, style guides, dictionaries, kind of sterile bits of the language, really. I mean, the language continues to move. Obviously, those, the grammar books, etc., are extremely important resources for people, and they attach a lot of value to it, and they do tend to slow down the rate of change. Think of, the fact we can read the literature of the 1700s, but those in the 1700s couldn't read the literature of, say, Geoffrey Chaucer, because the changes have just been so huge. So there has been a slowing down effect of these changes.
The weird stuff with that too, because I've been reading a lot of Australian history recently, especially around colonisation and a bit before, is just how much people like Dampier and Cook made so many spelling mistakes.
Well, there's no right way to spell in those days.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing. I think one of the ones I keep seeing is showed, and it's SHEWD. And so do you want to talk a bit about, I guess, the unique history of English? It has changed quite a lot, right, over the last 1,500 years.
It's changed hugely. I mean, Old English is like a foreign language now, and is learned like a foreign language. Doesn't sound anything like English. So all languages will change, but they will change. They don't have to change in this. There are rates of speeding or times of speeding up and times of slowing down. So coming in contact with other language will speed up the rate of change. And English came in contact with, the Vikings, so Norse. And it came into contact with French, and both those contact situations sped up the rate of change, and of course began our love affair with borrowing, if I use that stupid word that linguists use. We of course steal these words, we don't borrow them, but it's called borrowing. So
what happens in those situations? Because again, I've been watching a lot of this Viking history stuff recently, especially around the time of Alfred, and I think that was the next generation or two after the Danes first got to Northumbria and those places in the central England, North England. You've obviously got people who speak whatever it was, Anglo-Saxon, Old English, and then you have the Danes coming in with their, I guess it would have been Old Norse. what happens to each of those languages? Do they borrow from one another, but they're still primarily each other's languages? Like Old Norse takes, English words, English takes Old Norse words until it reaches equilibrium, or is it a lot faster than that?
Really good question, and it's good to compare that situation with the situation of the French. But with the Old Norse English contact, they would have been mutually understandable. They were more like dialects of the same language.
No kidding.
Yeah. So and there's good evidence for that. I mean, some people still debate it, but I've certainly seen first-hand accounts from that time where it's quite clear they could understand each other.
So it'd be like, say, Portuguese and Spanish, having a conversation like that.
Yes. Where they would be different would be in those grammatical endings.
Yeah.
Sort of basic vocabulary, they would have shared. I mean, it's slightly different pronunciation, different dialects, different accents, etc. But so what happens then is you get this kind of grammatical stripping. So that's when English started to lose the kind of grammatical endings, the case system, the gender system, all that started to break down. And it is interesting, exactly as you describe, with this kind of reciprocal arrangement with Norse and English, because the nature of the borrowings, again, if I use that stupid term, is that they were everyday vocabulary. Normally you don't swipe another word from another language unless you need it or it's got prestige, but the pronouns in English, they, them and their, Norse.
Yeah, I was learning Icelandic a few years ago, and the basics, and they were using the thea, like all those, and I was like, holy crap, it's the same, like that's where we get, and I think kavath is like what, and we get all those weird words from them.
Well, in fact, so close were the languages that we really can't tell just the extent of the number of Norse borrowings that came in.
Compared to what was already there.
Yeah, because they were so close, you don't really know, did that just change its shape, or is it actually a borrowing or not? We even borrowed inflectional endings, so grammatical endings, like, the S ending on something like he looks, is the Scandinavian, is the Norse, whereas we'd all be running around saying he looketh.
That's right, yeah, he hath and all that.
So that shows you that the contact was quite remarkable, that they would have been equal prestige, and that the lives of the Norse speakers and the English speakers were closely entwined.
Yeah.
For borrowings to happen, and also it would have happened at a time during the peaceful times, because if you're busy, sacking monasteries and pillaging, you're not going to have an impact on the language of that nature. So it would have happened during a time of peaceful settlement, and that's when all those Norse names, place names, as well.
I guess too, it had to do with the fact that the Norse and the French were wanting to stay. They weren't just raiding and then bailing. They were actually trying to get land, set up shop, and try and integrate and get wealthy as a result of that. But as a short sort of anecdote, I find it really funny, and I was thinking about this more recently. I have effectively a Portuguese only house when I'm with my wife. She's Brazilian, which is why I learn it. And we've just got our 11-month-old, so I'm trying to get him to speak it. I want to speak it, but I found that it's really funny and I have to try and prevent myself and my wife doing this, but anytime we're speaking in Portuguese and we can't think of the word we want to use, both she and I just use the English word and insert it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Don't worry about that, because that's, people do worry endlessly about, oh gosh, look at people worrying about the state of Australian slang because we might swipe a few words from American English. It's not going to matter. It's natural for languages to swipe words from here and there. And
yeah,
I work on Pennsylvania German, which is the language spoken by Amish Mennonite people.
Ah, very cool.
They swipe English words all the time. And in fact, one farmer said if you put Pennsylvania German in a winnowing mill and blew all the English words out, there wouldn't be anything left. And in a way is right. But, that's a sign of a healthy living language, that it's just swiping these words when it needs it.
But I was wondering, is that the process that would have happened, right? With the Norse coming over to England, you would have had English or the English people there at the time marrying Norse people, and then obviously having bilingual families, the kids being raised in this situation where there's multiple languages around, and they end up just saying, okay, I'm going to use this word, I'll use this word, and it just mixes into modern English.
I wouldn't have known what language they're speaking or what dialect, really, and because they were so close anyway. most certainly. And you know, as I said, the borrowings or the stealings are all everyday words. There's one, though, that's not, and that's interesting, and that's the word for law. Law is a Norse word. But if you look at what the English word was, it was "a."
Really?
Like the ash that Elon Musk has called his child now.
Yeah, he's.
Lawyers weren't saying, "Oh, well, I'm studying," or "at." You know, it's not really a viable word when it gets so short. So they swiped lahu, which became law in English. So that's one of the few kind of highfalutin kind of borrowings that we got from Scandinavia, as opposed to the French, where they're all from the top part of the vocabulary, the sort of words of nuance and refinement, and the posh stuff are the French borrowings.
So what happened there? Because we ended up with, I think, you know, you'd know this better than me, but 70% of English is French, right? Like at least the point is there's a huge chunk of English where vocab in particular, I don't know about grammar, but vocab is, you know, anything ending with "shon", any of the words ending in "li" are effectively "mont" words in French. You know, we use, I think, all of the different meats that we eat. We don't use the animal name, we use the French animal name.
Well, that shows you that they're, you know, as soon as it's turned into food, it's given a French name. And that shows you that the English was, you know, it was the language of the street. It was, but French dominated sort of culture, government, the legal system, the church, the arts, and words flooded into those areas. And even if you look at the meal times, you know, humble breakfast is, well, it's probably a Norse word. It might be a Norse-English blend, actually. But as soon as it's dinner or supper, you know, it's French. And they're the, I suppose, posher meal times, really, whereas brekkie is you know.
Why do Australians say tea? There's one for you. Like I know there's some weird thing happening there, right? Where we say, we used to say dinner for lunch and tea for dinner, but now we say breakfast, lunch and tea. And if you say, "Oh, we're going to have tea," to an American, they'll be like, "What? Why are you drinking tea?"
And I think you'll find parts of the UK have that too. So it's something we got from there. Those meal times kind of move around a bit. It's very, very befuddling to outsiders, I think. Yeah,
for sure. So what got you interested in linguistics? Was it something you always wanted to do and, you know, learn more about, or?
Well, you know, I had no idea there was a discipline called linguistics. No idea. And I was doing German, loving it, loving the literature as well. But then I fell into linguistics quite by accident. I had to find, as many students do, I had to find that unit that was going to make up my degree, and I fell into it a little bit later, and just thought, jeepers, just fascinating the way our language works. And what fascinates me most of all is the way it changes. I've always been interested in language change. So, you know, for my PhD thesis, I looked at 8,000 Dutch clauses from, you know, 1300 to 1650, and fascinated by the fact that words moved around in the sentence. The verb moved up closer to the front of the sentence. That is really, really interesting.
So do you speak Dutch? Do you have to speak Dutch in order to study it like that, or?
I could read it, and I got reasonably good at reading medical texts, because I looked at texts of instruction. That's part of the puzzle, as to how to find, you know, texts that are going to, as closely as possible, resemble the language that might have been spoken around that time. You assume they kind of wrote as they spoke in early times, but yes, I got okay at reading medical texts and dike building treatises and all sorts of text instruction. But yeah, I'm lousy at speaking Dutch now.
So is it true, though, that English is its closest sister language, if you want to call it that, is Dutch? And how do you measure that, right?
Yeah, or is it closest to French because it looks like French? It's obviously it's genetic, you know, part of the family tree is Dutch and German and indeed the Scandinavian languages. The reason it looks more like Dutch or Low German, in fact, is because German went through a sound change that didn't affect English or Dutch or Low German. So that's the change that shifted k sound in a word like book to buch in German.
Okay, it went deeper in the throat, did it?
It turned into what's called a fricative, so
yep.
Sound with friction. Yeah, and that's, you know, so pipe became pfeif and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what makes English look. Yeah, so Dutch does look somewhere in between English and German.
Yeah. So how do those things happen? Because I know that in English we had the great vowel shift, right? Where all of a sudden over a period of a few hundred years, I think 1400 to 1700, right? The vowels suddenly made a big switch.
Yes.
Is there some kind of an event or something that underpins that, or it's just completely random?
It's not random.
Yeah.
It's
You
chaos.
hope not. Otherwise we wouldn't be communicating, right? Sorry.
Oh, no, you're quite right. I think you hit the nail on the head. It looks complicated. Change involves a number of, sometimes they can be linguistic factors. In the case of the Great English Vowel Shift, something triggered a vowel to shift, and because vowel systems are symmetrical, that caused a kind of chain reaction change, and all of the vowels shuffled around. So that restored then the symmetry of the system. And so vowel and consonant shifts like that. In fact, the one I mentioned that German underwent was a similar sort of shift, but in consonants, where things just shuffled around. Because sound systems tend towards symmetry. It's a tendency. In language, anything, there aren't these kind of 100% universals. These are tendencies, strong tendencies. So yes, linguistic, there are these wildcard human factors, cultural factors that make it very, very hard to predict. There are social factors, phonetic factors, all sorts. And in a way, it's, snowballing effects. It's really hard. One of the hardest things in language change is to say, why does a change occur at that particular time in that language and not in another language with that same feature?
Well, it's almost like the evolution of animals, because I see that a lot when studying animals. You're kind of like, well, why did this one become red and that one stayed green? Why did its beak size slightly increase and this one didn't? And there has to be a reason, but it's very hard to try and work that out after the fact, right?
Presumably, it's be a number of reasons again, a coincidence or coinciding of factors in that case as well. Would that be right?
Yeah, it can also be, that it's just genetic drift where for whatever reason it's not a negative thing on the population, and so the population just goes that way. But there's so many interesting things in evolution like that the more I learn about linguistics, it seems like they're playing out. So
that term drift is exactly what some linguists use. The fact that, English, for example, is there's a momentum now and it's drifting in a certain direction. In fact, all of the Germanic languages are drifting in that same direction. And one of them is the loss of these grammatical endings that I mentioned.
Yeah.
We're all doing it. We're all just doing it at different times. We all got a negative marker equivalent to English not that follows the verb. Highly unusual, but we all did it, but at different times again. And that's an unusual feature for negation, so that's going to trigger something else to happen that's going to restore the negate at the front of the word again, which is already happening in some varieties. So it is fascinating. I think drift sounds kind of magical and mystical, but it's very true that it's almost like it's set on this sort of path and it'll continue to move in that direction.
I guess we have to remember too that the main goal, if not the primary goal, only goal is communication, and it doesn't really matter if it's correct or not. But what happens then?
I'll just pick you up on that before we move.
Go for it.
Yeah, communication, but also social. Don't underestimate the social factors. The idea that it's to identify the gang, to show who belongs, and that's a very big driver of change.
So is that changing in a world today where we're so much more connected than you would imagine we were even 50 years ago or 100 years ago? Is change being reduced because now I can watch TV shows from Great Britain, from America, I can hear all these accents, I can take words, I can understand it all? Or are we changing a lot more because we're now accessing all this other kind of information and we want to stand out?
A bit of both, I think.
Really?
Certainly, there is this kind of levelling, as you say, with kind of a global standard, if you could call it that. The fact that you can understand each other, certainly in the written language. It's easy to talk about standards when it comes to actual written word. And a lot of people worry that, we're going to lose what's distinctive about Australian English, for example. But we're not. We're all multi-dialectal. Change how we speak depending on who we're speaking to or, what we're talking about. But it's certainly true that the globalization, the internet, that's now speeding up the rate of change again. We're coming off the back of about 300 years of slow change, where even certain sound changes were reduced because of the clout of the written word, the importance of writing. You think, for example, that H is in the writing, I better not drop it. So we saw a big return of H's. But now the internet's speeding it all up again. Within a matter of hours, a word might have global take-up. Selfie is such a good example. Australian word that we gave the world. And in 1 year, that increased something. It was 17,000%. I think when I mentioned that earlier, it's another interview, I said 1,700. It was 17,000%.
Wow.
It had been around 2002, but no one paid much attention.
So
It took off.
For every word that takes off like that, would there be hundreds, if not thousands, that just never get any clout? And people try and come up with these words, and for whatever reason, they don't pick up because no one else likes the sound. And then there's just one that there's something there that just fits, and it just goes bananas.
And they become sort of global rock stars, like
I would imagine Americans wouldn't even know that. They'd be like, it's American word, right? What are you talking about?
It was Dutch word of the year as well. It fits in the Dutch sound system very nicely. And they've got the diminutive endings as well. So, yeah, they liked it as well. It's fascinating, isn't it? Why is okay such a success story? Now, that is an American one. But
yeah. And that's across languages, right? Because that's in Portuguese, it's in French, I've heard it in Asian languages, and you're like, they've just said, taken this as being like thumbs up, I imagine, or something, where it started one place and then it's just like, that is so easy and useful. Like, we'll use that.
It had equivalents. So it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, think the life cycle of words is really interesting. Why some drop by the wayside once, some take off and then die. Most of them will disappear of these kind of creations, but it's interesting to see what ones are taking off from Australian slang. I mean, something like budgie smugglers.
Do you want to explain what those are?
Cute little swimmers, can I call them that? Bathers.
Yeah, but they're only budgie smugglers when men are wearing them, right?
Right, yes. And there we could delve into the bird metaphor, but perhaps we shouldn't. Yeah.
I didn't realize, because there's an artist that does some amazing Australian paintings, and he has an image where there's underwear or swimmers, bathers on the line, and there's budgies jumping in and out and around them. And I was like, oh my God, like, it's just so classic, right?
That's lovely.
What was I going to say? I had a pertinent question, but I lost it. All right. Why do Australians find New Zealand accents so funny? I was thinking about this the other day, and I'm like, do New Zealanders hear Australians and laugh? And do Canadians listen to Americans and laugh? Are there dialects in Britain where they find each other humorous? Because maybe it's just me, but whenever I hear New Zealanders say sex instead of six and fush and chups instead of fish and chips, there's something in me that just giggles a bit. Is there something going on there that leads to it being somewhat humorous?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, what triggers these reactions towards an accent. It's got nothing to do with the sounds themselves. There's nothing intrinsically comical about vowels raising, for example, which is what's happening in New Zealand English. So it's underpinned by, again, social aspects, and it is curious why some accents seem beautiful to us and some seem unpleasant sounding. Why I go weak at the knees with the Irish accent, for example.
Which one?
Well, indeed, that's right. All of them, actually. Yes, those that have the sort of Celtic under feature.
Oh man, I remember listening to the Cause when they were singing and getting interviewed, and I'd just be like, my God, that accent is amazing. But it was weird. It was almost gendered. Like, it was, for me, it was the women who had the Irish accent. I found that very attractive, but the guys sounded a bit effeminate, and I was like, ooh. But Scottish men, you'd be like, yes, that's like tough, the Glaswegian accent. But on women, you'd be like, whoa, that's a bit too much. So
there are associations. You associate it with a certain place or a certain, that then becomes, the symbol for toughness or whatever, and some people love that kind of accent. If the Birmingham accent, I love too, but some people find it, maybe they associate it with the, industrial part of the UK or something like that. And whereas they prefer those accents they associate with picturesque, rural, quaint villages, that does more for them. It's very hard to, it's very personal what sort of connotations accents acquire for people over time.
Well, it's very interesting, right? Australia versus the UK, because we obviously had so many different pockets of people come over here, and they formed this kind of homogenous dialect over a vast continent. But you go to Great Britain, and it seems like you walk 20 miles and you're in another village with a completely different accent. Even today, what's maintaining that kind of diversity in a day and age where we're so connected?
Yeah, they are being levelled out to a certain extent, but the fact that English in Australia is so remarkably uniform in a country which is quite massive, really, when you think about how English is spread all over the place, that has something to do with that original melting pot and the fact that the settlement was pretty quick. And also you got mini melting pots. So as soon as you got regional differences happening or emerging, because they will emerge, then you got more, influx into the gold fields or the boom in pastoral, in sheep shearing industry. More people come, more levelling, more uniformity. And you think that English hasn't been here that long, not long in terms of language change. Differences are now happening. If you think of the certain vowel sounds that are changing in Australia. So in Melbourne, Melbourne might be pronounced as Malbon. People talk about the celery-salary merger. So that vowel in before celery and the vowel before salary in that first vowel.
My wife would say, they're both the same. They're both the same.
Well, for some speakers they are. For some speakers, shell and shall are homophones. Ellen and Alan causes terrible problems for people with that name. So interesting things happening to vowels before L's. But once upon a time, Australian English was moving in the same direction as New Zealand English. So there was the great Antipodean vowel shift happening.
Yes, because it seems that we were joined, right? New Zealand was part of New South Wales for, I don't know exactly, but decades at least after colonisation, but then it got annexed or whatever and became its own country. And has their accent evolved as quickly as Australian English as well, or just on a sort of similar trajectory?
They're diverging now, which is what you'd expect. So languages don't have to change in the same way when they're in different parts of the world, because there will then be these other factors. The sort of language, the Maori is a big part of New Zealand English, and Maori English is having quite an influence on New Zealand English. And there's that trajectory I mentioned of the great vowel shift. So the New Zealand vowels are rising, just as in the Great English vowel shift that you mentioned earlier, the one between kind of Chaucer and Shakespeare. Vowels rise more usually than they fall, although, I'm not a phonetician, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. However, our vowels over here tend to be dropping. So when I hear students say a word like dress, it sounds a little bit more like drass.
Drass, yeah. It
almost rhymes with crass.
Does the next generation typically want to put its own mark on the language too? Is that why we get an uptick in slang? For example, my dad, and I don't know if he's tongue-in-cheek taking the piss or what, but he always says dead horse, or, uses the Cockney rhyming slang. And I'm like, Dad, no one says that. Like it's a joke. You say it as a joke, you wouldn't say it seriously anymore, at least my generation. But is that just because they did it and I want to be different,
Yes, exactly. That's the social aspect. So it's not all about communication. Obviously, that's an important part of language, clearly. But don't underestimate those social factors, the socio-cultural factors, being big drivers of change. You don't want to speak like him any more than he wants to speak like you. And words are a good way to they're more straightforward, I suppose.
So do we speak multiple dialects simultaneously then, as I think you mentioned before? Because it's so funny that there seem to be different registers of the language that you would use, right, or dialects that you would use. I would speak to an official a very different way than I would speak to a child, or my father would even if he knows what I use as language, he wouldn't necessarily use it himself personally. And is that a really important part of language, or is that a hindrance?
No, that's very, very important. I mean, obviously that we can understand each other is clearly extremely important. And that's also a driver of change. The fact that as you and I are chatting, we're very subtly accommodating to each other's accent. And this accommodating factor is very important.
Is that like when you cross your arms and someone does it in front of you to try and mirror what you're doing?
Exactly. So yeah, that's right. You might do that kind of thing. It's not conscious that you do it, but it's extremely important, and that is what also helps to sort of spread change or spread an innovation that you can pass it on, usually face to face.
Do we have the same sort of thing happening in Australian English with the Indigenous community that you have? I think it's called, is it Ebonics in the US? I'm not sure if I've got that wrong, but the fact that African Americans, I can hear them on the radio, I can hear them, and I'll say to my wife, yeah, they're African American, and she'll be like, what? How can you tell? And I'm like, I don't know. I just know that accent, or that the way that they're talking is African, even if they're not using slang, just the pronunciation. Can you talk a bit about that? Yeah.
English is a very important part of Australian English, just like what is sometimes called ethnolects. So you might have sort of the varieties of Australian English that are coming from kids who have been born here, but to Greek or Italian parents, say, or Lebanese parents. They're now using these features to show their ethnicity.
Fully six subwoofer. Yeah.
Exactly. Once upon a time it was, they moved right away from there. The time of Con the Fruiter, Effie and all that, that kind of ethnic.
Is it that couple of days? How long? Couple of days. Yeah.
That's exactly right. But now it's interesting to see what features are being adopted then to show their identity. It's really, really important. And Aboriginal English is the same. I mean, those communities are multilingual, and a lot of Australians don't realise the fact that they've probably got 2 or 3 Aboriginal languages under their belt, and they're coping with English as well, and perhaps also a Creole, an English-based Creole. So they tend to, well, we all do this to a certain extent. Some people talk about a kind of Creole continuum, so there'll be Creole, the English-based Creole down one end, and there'll be something close to standard English down the other end, except perhaps in matter of accent, and then they'll move along the continuum depending on who they're speaking to. If they're speaking in the family, obviously they'll be down the Creole end. If they're in school, they might be down the other end. But what's really important is, and this is so hard to get across to people, is that something like Aboriginal English is and like what's sometimes dubbed Ebonics, although that's a term that's kind of fallen out of favour because there was such a kerfuffle around it. But to build on the home dialect of kids, I mean, some educators unfortunately see, it is important to sort of expose kids to the standard, because that's not fair not to. However, to be told that your home language is not a viable dialect, really.
That must be to put it bluntly, it's kind of a clusterfuck, right? Which in Australia, because I find that I want to talk a lot about Indigenous stuff on the podcast, but it seems so difficult to really wrap your head around, the way in which colonization is sort of still being pushed out onto them, right? Because you want them to thrive in Western society, but in order for that to happen, they kind of have to lose what makes them unique about their Aboriginality, right? Like if you're going to live in the middle of even if you don't want to necessarily have that happen, it's going to happen. If you become a lawyer and you're Indigenous from Alice Springs, chances are you're not going to speak like someone who lives off the land in the more rural parts of Australia, right? So what is the right thing to do there with conserving those languages and wanting to conserve the cultures, but also wanting to give them a shot in society?
Well, the thing is, and that's again what people don't realise, that they're so worried that the first dialect that they have, which might be Aboriginal English or Creole or, is a hindrance to acquiring standard English, but it isn't, because we all can be, as I said, multi-dialectal. Multilingualism is the norm in the world.
Yeah.
And it's places like Australia and I had a colleague, Michael Klein, used to talk about the monolingual mindset. It's this idea that English is all you need, and anything else is going to get into the way. I've had people tell me, I shouldn't speak Vietnamese to my child because that's going to stop them from learning English. No, it's not. If you build on the first language or the first dialect, then it actually helps the acquisition of the standard language, if that's your goal. So it's crazy.
I imagine that if you sever that too, like you say, I'm not going to teach them Vietnamese. It's like, bam, you've severed them from your culture, from your family, from, that. Like I had a kid who was my best friend in high school, and his dad was Italian, his mum was the Filipino. Both of them had families previously, and so he had a lot of relatives back in those countries. Neither of them taught him their languages, and they only spoke English at home. And so he was always like, you've left me with so much work to do.
That's right. He's really missing out. Yeah, but it's also linguistically sound, because it's quite clear that kids who are bilingual have a greater sort of flexibility in the mind, and they can, appreciate structure too in other, in the language that they're acquiring faster than, say, monolingual kids. They get it.
It's insane, right? We had a family that we became friends with. The father was Hungarian, the mother was Brazilian. They were living in Australia. The kids spoke all three languages, and I don't think they knew they were different languages, but we go to their house and they would speak Portuguese to mum, Hungarian to dad, and if we started with Portuguese, they'd use that, but as soon as I said anything in English and they realised I was Australian, they would just switch to English.
Yeah.
And then the weirdest thing was that they chose Hungarian to speak between each other.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I remember asking them, how did you decide that? Did you guys have a vote one day? And they were like, what? We don't know.
I don't know what they're doing.
But it did blow my mind how, I guess, elastic the mind is, how they can just adapt to that and it's nothing. It's just...
And I don't know why we can't show, people the brain scans to show that there's more grey matter there in the bilingual, multilingual brain. It's a difficult message to get across because, as my colleague says, there's kind of monolingual mindset that people think, well, I don't know why it's so difficult.
Is that a big part of why Australians tend to not learn foreign languages?
Yep.
Or is it also that we're isolated to some degree and we don't have a clear choice of which language we should learn?
Well, because I suppose it's you can get by with just English, and learning another language is hard, very hard.
Do we just not play up the benefits of it though?
Linguists try to, but somehow the message isn't getting through. It's a bit like climate change, I fear. People, they know about it, therefore they're not interested in hearing.
It always seems to be one of those things where the people are cut off the most tend to be the most extreme in terms of their views, especially, like I remember going to Queensland, going far north, and there was a guy there who was ranting about Muslims. And I was like, mate, you're half Indigenous Australian and Australian. You live in, I can't remember, it would have been above Cairns. Yeah. Where are the Muslims? Like, who is here? What TV show have you been watching? They're not a threat to you, and they're not even here. I'm like, if you met any of them, you would totally ditch this. Do you think it's the same with language learning where it narrows our view down? Because I feel like I've learned a heap more about other cultures the more I learn foreign languages.
Exactly. It opens up all these worlds to you when you've got the language. Yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. No, and the research is quite clear, but somehow the message ain't getting across.
All right, last question before I let you go is, should people learning Australian English try and pick up things like slang and swearing? I get asked that quite a lot. It seems below me, or I wouldn't use slang or swearing in my own language. Should I do it in Australian English? How would you answer that question if someone came to you and asked, should I use any slang? Should I use any swearing at all in Australian English?
The tricky one with the swearing, because you often find that people who learn Australian English as a second language or third or fourth might well overdo the swearing in a way that, because there's plenty of studies that show this too. Swear words in a second language don't raise goose flesh, if I could put it loosely like that, in the same way, because they're acquired later in life, so they're not embedded, they're stored differently in the brain, and they don't have the same cathartic effect, and they might well be overused. So I suppose you've got to guard against that. Like anything, you just teach appropriate use of these words. And same with slang, that slang should be taught to be, it's an important part of Australian English. There are times when you use it, there are times when you don't. You wouldn't probably write servo in an essay, but you need to know these.
Well, and it is interesting when you were talking about in-group, out-group and the dialect you're using, because I feel if someone who had a clear foreign accent, say someone who's moved here from India, but they're speaking Australian English with slang, if I had an American right next to them who used no slang, I would instantly feel a sort of connection with the person using the slang, even though English isn't their first language, because I'd feel some sort of underlying, okay, they understand, they get my culture, there's a connection there.
Very much. Slang is a big part of that kind of verbal cuddling that we do. Slang and and even swear words. The more you like someone, the almost the worse the insult or the worse the swear word, because you're all jolly good fellows, you're all part of the in-group. And social swearing, and that's what people also don't realise, social swearing is the most usual form of swearing.
Yeah.
But when you're sitting with your mates and you're relaxed, and that's when the swear words come. Abusive swearing is less usual. Cathartic swearing, you hit your thumb with a hammer, or you've just pressed the send button and dispatched that email that shouldn't have gone off. That's also there as well, but that will bubble up naturally, and that will probably, the word might be in the first language in that case.
What is that doing then? The social swearing, is that reinforcing connection somehow between people?
Yeah, and it's because it's not part of the standard, so you're showing your in-groupness, if I could put it that way.
You're like doing the taboos in front of one another, and you're like, no one tell anyone else. We're in this together. We committed the crime together.
That's right. Yeah, you're breaking the rules, Exactly right. And of course, it's just a natural part of everyday colloquial language, really. But, that's not just in Australian English. That's around the English-speaking world as well. First study that was done was on they were zoologists in the Arctic. And, during 24 hours of night, I think. And there was a lot of social swearing there as well. It was by far the most usual sort of swearing. So it's not just in Australian English. That kind of banter. It's British English.
Well, my dad's always saying that there's a big difference between being a cunt and being a mad cunt. Like
a bastard and a bastard with the long vowel.
I know it is bizarre, isn't it? How like the same word can be 100%. It can be a positive thing or it can be a very negative thing, right? Like it's all context based. I did lie. I had one more that I really wanted to ask you. I'm sorry if you really need to go. What is happening with changes in euphemisms being used for certain things in English? So, for instance, I watched George Carlin. I really like him, and there's a piece that he does. He's a comedian from America, and he talks about in World War I, we used shell shock to talk about, soldiers getting nervous, their nervous systems breaking down. Then it was battle fatigue, then operational exhaustion, and then post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it seemed to get further and further away from what it actually meant. Why do we do that? Because it seems like with political correctness these days too, quite often the language is changing and you have to kind of keep up with it, right?
Yes, but that's the turnover of euphemisms is a bit like the turnover of slang. They will be short-lived. Very few euphemisms survive, and if they do survive, it's usually they become a direct term. I mean, toilet is a good example. That was a euphemism once meaning little cloth in French.
Yeah.
Same turnover, I don't know, lavatory becoming water closet, becoming WC, becoming toilet, becoming bathroom, becoming washroom. We will change these slang terms because, of course, the next generation will grow up learning it as a direct term and the cover will be blown, the magic's gone, and it has to be replaced. And get there's the kind of, I hate saying dishonest euphemism because in a way it's all dishonest.
Yeah. Well, because that's the hard thing, right? Especially with, say, race. You're trying to say, it used to be, I think, coloured people, then people of color, and then blacks is okay now, it changes quite a lot. African Americans, and you kind of, it is, as you say, it's kind of fake because quite often the person is just trying to refer to that thing without any prejudice, right? But they get caught up on it because that was last week's phrase and this week it's a different one.
And there you get a fairly rapid turnover of terms because, you will adopt whatever's you think is the right term because you don't want to sound like a bigot or whatever. You don't want to be branded with those who might use that term. But it is tricky because in that case it's naming, isn't it? So it's what the group prefers to be called, and then it will depend on whether you've got natural cover and a part of that group or not, because some of the highly offensive ones can remain in use, but only used by people of the in-group and certainly not by outsiders.
The N-word, right?
Yes, indeed, absolutely. It is tricky. And in the case of the dishonest euphemisms, so in the area of war or, politics or where there's deliberate manipulation going on. I mean, all euphemisms are dishonest in the way that, none of them say it as it is, but that's sort of protecting us. Because we have these taboos, we don't want to talk directly about death, disease, whatever. So we have these ways of managing those, the things that go bump in the night for us. But when you've got this kind of, deliberate manipulation, because when, death becomes terminal living or...
Well, does it help or not, right? Because it does remove you from it, but it feels like with death, it's so hidden today. People pass away.
Yes.
It becomes almost more traumatic than it should be because it's so hidden, right?
So, well, yes, and and it's not like Newspeak, like George Orwell's Newspeak, when none of us are fooled by a lot of this deceptive stuff that goes on by politicians, etc. But there is plenty of linguistic evidence too to show that loaded words can manipulate our memories, can manipulate our views of something, our thinking, and certainly if you are perpetrating some sort of dastardly bad deed or some dirty deed, I think you could argue that it does help you.
The final solution, you mean? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. That makes you feel better about the whole thing. If you're up front and said exactly what it was, you might not, I think there is that idea of distancing, responsibility, stepping away from it if you use this kind of language. What's that? There's a beautiful, in fact, George Orwell talks about, if I can remember the quote, he talks about language that makes murder respectable. I can't remember the exact quote, but he talks about exactly this sort of thing, or the sort of language that turns, I don't know, traffic jams into localized capacity deficiencies, that toothbrushes into home plant removal implements. There's that kind of language too. It's making it sound grander.
Yeah, right. So that might be used for products to make it sound a bit more prestige, and
So there are euphemisms and euphemisms. They're differently motivated, I think. It's all sweet-sounding language, and there are some that are euphemisms that are kind of almost, what did my colleague describe it as, a bit like being diaphanous lingerie, that conceals just enough to be a bit more titillating. There's that too. So it's complex. It's really interesting.
Well, I always find that funny with swearing, right? Where you'll say, "Oh, F me," or "freaking hell," and it's like, well, you knew what you were referring to. Yeah. Everyone else knows what you were referring to, so why not just use it? Whereas, my grandmother, if I said, "Oh, freaking hell," she wouldn't bat an eyelid. But if I said, "Oh, fucking hell," she would be like, "Peter,"
Quite.
Anyway, Kate Burridge, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. It's been good to chat.